But he was working as a drywaller for that year after graduation. And I remember just sitting with him going through they weren't easy conversations for Marc-Andre, where I was like, what do you really want? I don't see this as a long-term thing for you. Like you're just kind of putting in time right now. And, he finally said, well, I really want to go to Squamish and I want to really start climbing.
This is Andrew Petty is Dying, where we tap into the power of our mortality to become the people we were made to be and live the lives we were made to live. I'm your host, Andrew Petty, and I'm dying. I hate to say it, but so are you. If I've learned anything in the last 3 years, it's that life and death are so much bigger than us. You embraced life and love with all your amazing energy, which still reverberates. You were still with us on walks in the forest, on windy ridges, in a sunlit moment after the rain, in the love, laughter, and music of your friends and family. You are there in dreams that seem more real than waking moments. Every day I think of you on your timeless flight. I love you with all my heart and miss you more than words can say. Michelle Kuipers wrote this heart-rending caption for an Instagram post on March 5th, 2021, the third anniversary of the death of her son, Marc-Andre Leclerc, who died in 2018 descending the Mendenhall Towers in Alaska with his climbing partner, Ryan Johnson. Marc-Andre's life is the subject of the acclaimed 2021 documentary, The Alpinist, currently available on Netflix. Michelle also appeared in the film. Marc-Andre's story changed my life. Or maybe more accurately, is changing my life. And I know I'm not alone. Michelle's Instagram feed is full of messages from people saying the very same thing. For the first few days after watching The Alpinist, I was unsettled and on edge, stirred up and antsy, aware that Marc-Andre's story had awakened something deep within me, something that I wasn't yet able to identify or articulate, but wouldn't leave me alone, something that needed attention. Which is odd on the one hand, because although I do love being out in nature's wild places, I've never aspired to anything like the kind of audacious adventures that Marc-Andre undertook. I'm not an alpinist, as he was, or even a climber. But the fact that his story is changing my life nonetheless, as different as we are and as different as our stories are, reveals that The Alpinist is ultimately not a story about remarkable feats in the alpine environment. It's not a climbing movie merely. It's a story about hearing and heeding our unique calling in life, wholeheartedly and unapologetically, and without self-conscious concern for its relative value or utility in the world. It's a story about being ourselves, being the one and only me, the one and only you, with guts, gusto, and abandon. It's a story about how writing a great story with our life can change other people's lives. And that's the gift of Marc-Andre's story in my life, the exhortation and admonition to be me. That's what was awakened within me and demanded attention when I first watched The Alpinist. Even though I've been on a journey to become who I was made to be for many years now, and as a coach, I help others on the same journey, my reaction to The Alpinist showed me that I was still wrestling deep in my heart with whether it was okay or enough. Marc-Andre's story brought that internal conflict to the surface and gave me the confidence to put my doubts to rest. Perhaps the most important subplot in The Alpinist is the relationship between Marc-Andre and his mom. That part of the storyline absolutely captivated me. How had Michelle summoned the courage and the wisdom to help Marc-Andre discover and pursue such an audacious calling? How had she helped Marc-Andre become who he was made to be? I wanted to know more. So I reached out to Michelle on Instagram from out of the blue. And long story short, much to my surprise and pleasure, Michelle agreed to be on the show. In this exclusive conversation, Michelle and I dig deeper into the story, exploring questions like, what did the documentary leave out? How did Michelle cope with worry when Marc-Andre was out on a solo climb? What was Marc-Andre's philosophy of life? And how does Michelle live differently because of her son's life and tragic death? And Michelle's account of Marc-Andre's first climbing experience will surprise you. This episode is also a paradigm-shifting masterclass in how to live sovereign, empowered, and purposeful lives. It's a goldmine. If you enjoyed The Alpinist, you'll love getting to know Marc-Andre even better through Michelle's eyes. and you'll be equipped with wisdom and insight for your own life from a remarkable woman. We recorded this episode on March 10th, coincidentally the 4th anniversary of the day Michel returned from Alaska without Marc-Andre, after the effort to recover his body at the base of the Mendenhall Towers had been abandoned. I feel extremely fortunate to have spent time with Michel on a day fraught with so many emotions, to celebrate, honor, and learn from a remarkable man and his remarkable mom. And now, without further ado, I invite you into the conversation. Michel, what was it like to watch The Alpinist for the first time?
Well, it was not a first time in that I sat and watched the whole movie from beginning to end when it was finished. It was kind of a process. So some of the first scenes that I actually saw were the week that we were in Juneau, after we found out that there would be no recovery of Marc-Andre and Ryan Johnson. And we had the Sender Films team there. And one of the things that they wanted to do that evening of that day was to just take some time and look at some of those video clips together as a group. So that was where I first saw sort of an example of what they had been putting together over the previous few years. And from there, there was some discussion around what do we do with this film now? And there was some back and forth with the Sender team. And so, of course, they wanted to kind of rework the story. And I had an opportunity because I travel for work. So I had an opportunity when I went to Colorado for a conference to sit and see sort of a rough cut of the film. And again, to sit and spend some time with the team, kind of going through sort of what my sort of gut response was to that film, my thoughts about it. And so it was kind of a development in process. By the time I saw the final cut, I would say I was at peace with the film. My reaction was that they did a great job telling a beautiful story as much as they could do within 90 minutes. I had sort of made peace with the film before I even saw it. I understood that for Sender Films, for the people making it, it was a commercial enterprise for them, that it's what they do for a living. It's what pays their mortgage. It's what's going to put their kids through college. And so I understood right from the get-go that this film was not going to be, sort of a keepsake for the family personally. I was okay with letting go of that aspect of it. So I would say it was kind of, a pleasant surprise that at the end of the day, I was happy with the film and that the rest of the family was happy with the film.
And you mentioned earlier that the first time you got to see clips from the film was when you were in Juneau and the recovery process was going on, the search and rescue process was ongoing. Was that the evening that you watched it? Was that the night when it had been concluded that they'd been lost in the avalanche?
That's right.
My goodness. That just strikes me as an appallingly difficult day. I can't begin to imagine. But then what was it like to watch those clips that evening?
It was like we still had him with us. Yeah.
What was your involvement in crafting the ending that became the actual ending of the movie, kind of telling the rest of the story as it had unfolded? I guess they were about to wrap, right? They were about to wrap the film, and then this happened. And so suddenly you've got the rest of the story in front of you. How were you involved in collaborating on that?
There was some discussion around how they wanted to tie that piece together. But, I didn't really have any desire to exert any creative control over it. And I really kind of left it up to them to do that. So like where they included some clips from the celebration of life in Squamish and that sort of thing, I was actually kind of surprised to see that there. I hadn't realized that was even being filmed, but I didn't have any issue with it. I think they did the best that they could with what they had. And I think they concluded the film in a really kind of beautiful way, as sad as the story is, of course.
And you mentioned that you understood that the film wouldn't become a keepsake for your family. Has that in fact proven to be the case, that your relationship with the film is not one of a keepsake or a memento?
I guess it's one of a number of keepsakes or mementos.
I'm not sure if this is the case or not, but I realized that it was very possible that you'd never seen footage of Marc-Andre's most audacious undertakings, because of course you couldn't be at the top of Cerro Egger or the top of Mount Robson. You couldn't be in those places with them. Yeah.
Yeah.
What was it like to see footage of him in those extreme conditions? I mean, you kind of knew, I would guess, in your heart and mind that he was out doing these things, but you had in some sense, the benefit of some distance from the most dangerous moments.
Well, I had seen him climb solo before the film, but not in those kind of environments. He had actually taken me climbing in the Chilliwack River Valley up a local mountain here. And the way that we did that was he would just climb up ahead of me solo and carrying the ropes. And I was in a harness, and then he would get clipped in. And then he would tell me to follow, and I would try to follow and do a terrible job of it. So I had seen him climb solo, and I had seen some clips of earlier video of him on the Chief. And I always felt like, he was very much in control of what he was doing. We had discussed it. I felt like as far as Marc-Andre climbing solo on something like the Chief, his chances of just randomly falling off of it were no higher than me just randomly falling over my feet on the sidewalk. But yeah, some of those clips when I saw them in the movie were, really striking, I guess, in just the extreme environment, the conditions that he was doing that in. And climbing the Stanley head wall, I think it was difficult for me to watch that. And it is still difficult for me to watch that.
And what are you aware of that makes it difficult to watch? What is it that you're feeling and experiencing as you're watching him do that?
I think in particular, the Stanley head wall was just how tenuous those holds were and how precise those moves had to be. As much as I trusted his ability to do what he did, and I trusted his judgment to make those decisions when he was climbing in those environments, it was still really hard to see.
As I'm watching it, I'm trying to put myself in his position and imagining what it might have felt like to have been that exposed. And I get sick to my stomach just imagining myself being in those positions. We have little climbing gyms around here, and one's got a 40-foot wall, and it doesn't look like anything. And I'll get about 2/3 up that thing and start to feel really exposed. And I'm in a harness, all kinds of safety measures. And it's just a remarkable state of mind that he possessed and/or cultivated for himself in those environments. And to your point about the tenuousness of the holds, it appeared to me as the viewer that in all of his solo ascents, he never made a mistake of any consequence. And that's just astounding given the environments he placed himself in, and just really speaks to the caliber of athlete and adventurer that he was, but also just the ability to remain, I just think at some point I would have flipped out. His just ability to remain completely poised. And, he even said in various ways throughout the documentary that he feels really completely at ease. What do you make of that? You know him, you knew him so well from a baby. You watched all of his developmental stages. What do you make of the fact that he felt more focused, more poised, maybe even more calm in those environments than in other environments? What was that about?
I think there's a couple of things that were going on for him. One is just the way he was wired. He came into this world as an incredibly intense individual. I used to say he arrived on this planet enraged to be in the body of a helpless infant. And I knew that we would both be happier as soon as he could start moving and he could express his avid mental activity through physical activity. And when he could do that, he was a calmer person. So, that was sort of, in a way, to some degree, a natural state of being for Marc-Andre. So I know that he cultivated a calm mind. I know that he cultivated those things, but at the same time, he was also wired that way. And where it would be an absolutely natural response for you, for me, for most people in a situation like that to completely lose it. It was his natural response to actually be calmer. He was probably more likely to feel like he was going to lose it sitting in a classroom, not being able to move or freely express himself physically. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it too is Marc-Andre invested thousands of hours in his craft. It wasn't like he just got up on these climbs and pulled it out of thin air. He, even as a 10 or 11-year-old, when he was first starting at the climbing gym, he would ride his bike to the gym and he would be there for 3, 4, 5 hours. He would climb and climb and climb. And when he started climbing without ropes, it wasn't doing the entire chief in one go. It wasn't doing the Stanley head wall. His progression was sort of a cumulative, incremental approach. So those climbs on the Stanley head wall or Mount Robson or Torrey Egger were sort of the grand finale, as it were, of thousands of climbs that came before, of the investment of hours and hours of practice, and not in just the one aspect of climbing. And this is where somebody more familiar with climbing could speak to it better than I can. But he was highly proficient, or a master in multiple kinds of climbing, and then he would pull it all together. And that was how Marc-Andre did things as a child. Like, he wanted to master how to do a backflip. Well, he wasn't one of those kids that tried it twice and got it. He probably tried it like 500 times and then he got it. And he was just really tenacious, and he would do things until he had mastered them. So there was those two things that came together for him.
Innate wiring and acquired competence.
Absolutely.
Where is he in the pecking order of your kids?
He's the middle child.
Middle child. Can we talk more about just what it was like to be his mom? First, I want to conclude sort of our discussion around the Alpinist and your relationship with it. What do you want us to know that the Alpinist couldn't or didn't portray?
Well, the Alpinist only had 90 minutes to show a really complex life and an incredible story. And of course, the premise of the film was to primarily focus around Marc-Andre as a climber. So it couldn't necessarily focus on Marc-Andre and all the other aspects of who he was as a person. It touched on that. It showed him doing the hula hoop dance, singing with Heavy. It showed him playing music on his guitar and hanging out with the family that he made friends with in El Chalten, and some aspects of that. But like, what it couldn't really show was his deep intellect. How well read he was, his sense of humor. Marc-Andre could just make you laugh. He could talk in rhyme. He could just rap at will. So, he had those aspects of himself too. And, he was like a connoisseur of climbing history. I think he'd read everything that had ever been written about it. I mean, that wasn't the only thing that he read about. He cared deeply about other topics as well. And it's difficult for the film, I think, to show, holistically who he was as a person, all those other aspects. And then also too, he had many more relationships besides his relationship with me and with Brett. And there's, obviously Brett and I get a lot of feedback from people who've seen the film, and they say, they're really sorry for our loss, and they hope that Brett and I are doing well. But, in that, there's Marc-Andre's father, there's his brother and sister, there's his grandparents, there's many close friends, there's his aunt who was kind of like a big sister to him, and nieces. And so there was a lot of other people who were a big part of Marc-Andre's life. And the film really didn't have the time to show the depth and the importance of those relationships to him as well. And that's not a complaint. That's just an observation.
Well, that's a good place to turn the corner then into, what it was like to be his mom. And something that you just mentioned about the rest of his relationships in the family and thing leads me to want to know more about what place family had in his life.
Family had a big place in Marc-Andre's life. He would make every effort to get home for things like Christmas or milestone events. I think of picking him up off the bus to go to his sister's university graduation. And I think he had been awake for 2 days, climbing mountains, managed to grab a backpack and jump on a bus. He was so tired, I had to get on the bus and wake him up because he didn't get off on his own. And he's at his sister's graduation. You can see he's still got dust in his hair. And he's wearing climbing clothes, but he's so happy to be there, and she was so happy to have him there. He took his role as being a big brother to his younger brother seriously, give him lectures on don't make mistakes I've made, or, here's where I believe in you, and their shared love of music. I never pressured Marc-Andre to be home for certain things. If he needed to go to Patagonia, and of course their seasons are opposite to ours, and that meant he was going to be in El Chalten over Christmas, so be it. I really didn't want to be that parent who made my adult kid feel bad about, oh, you're not home for Christmas, or you're not here for Easter, or you're not here for my birthday, or whatever. I said, I'm just happy when you get home, whenever that is. But it seemed like for him, once he had experienced those things, he made every effort to be home. In fact, the last Christmas that he was with us, he was originally supposed to be in California with Brett's family, and he changed his plans, and he decided to come and spend some time with our family here in BC, so he could be close to us. So yeah, family was important to him.
How would you describe his relationship with his siblings? Sibling relationships are complex things. I have a younger sister, and I'm 48 now, and I would say in our 40s together, we've just begun to really cultivate a deeper adult relationship. So it's not obvious that if you're blood and if you're siblings then you're close. So how did those three relate?
Well, I think before I even get into their story, I'd have to say that when siblings lose a sibling, it is really hard, because often my daughter, people would say to her, wow, how's your mom doing? They wouldn't ask her how she's doing, right? It was almost like the sibling relationship is not as considered as strong a bond as the parental relationship, or the partner in that. There's a lot of obviously outpouring of love and concern for Brett. And Marc-Andre's siblings, I think, have felt to some degree sort of that lack of acknowledgement that, this has been the most painful thing that they've ever experienced in their life, losing their brother. And, to go back to their childhood, they were actually really close. As a family, we didn't live near extended family. We didn't have a lot of resources, financially. We were just pretty dependent and reliant on each other. We spent a lot of time together, and the kids spent a lot of time together. And they were pretty good friends, for the most part. We did a lot of outdoor activities as a family. And so it was always us and them, and exploring a trail, heading to the beach in Nanaimo, turning over rocks, looking for crabs, lighting a fire and just having something to eat and some hot chocolate. And so we did a lot of that. When you have to be creative, when you don't have any financial resources, that means a lot of the time the kids played games together. We would have to walk long distances together because we didn't have a car. And so you walk long distance together as a family. That, facilitates conversation. If the weather was terrible, I would kind of try and turn it into an adventure. So instead of just acknowledging the reality that we're walking home in the dark and sideways rain and it's miserable, we would come up with some story, and that these intrepid children who are on this adventure, they've been kidnapped by pirates and they're off to save somebody. And it just so happens that it's dark and raining, because so many stories start with it's a dark and stormy night. So, you activate their imagination, and now they're partners in the same shared story. When Marc-Andre was in grade 2, I started schooling him at home. There was a lot of advantages to having him schooled at home. I just enjoyed what it provided for us as a family. So his sister did homeschool for a few years as well. So they were homeschooled together. And, again, that sort of facilitates a closeness that maybe other families, the kids don't necessarily get when they're in different grades and have different friends. And they also climb together. They were on the same climbing team for quite some time. And they were each other's climbing partner, belay partner. So I would say that the kids grew up with really tight bonds. And, of course, going through the teen years, there's always all the teen emotions and things come into play, and there's more friction as each kid kind of works out their own identity. But, coming through that slightly tumultuous time, those bonds again, just really solidified. And, my daughter has reams of messages that she saved from all their chats one of the funny things about the film is how the filmmakers just couldn't seem to find Marc-Andre or get any information on where he was. And yet we always knew where he was. We were always in communication with him, even if he didn't have a phone. And, and he would be having these long chats with his siblings at that time. Some of those chats were actually complaining about being chased by the filmmakers.
So even if he was off on a solo thing and wanted to be out of touch with everybody else in the world, he was always in touch with you guys.
He was, yeah. He was always in touch. Like, I wouldn't always know when he was going to take on a big solo, but he always let me know as soon as he was back.
Marc-Andre's life and story certainly stunned me and had a big impact on me. We'll talk more about that later, but I really wanted to have this conversation with you, Michelle, because I was just so struck by who you are and who you have been as one of the chief architects of the man that Marc-Andre became. And I don't mean architect in the sense that you drew up his plans for the kind of human he was going to be, but I don't know what the right metaphor would be. But, even from an early age, when you said you guys were, didn't have resources and you were walking places instead of riding in a car. And as a mom, there are many different ways to respond, I would imagine, in that moment. Or as a parent, you could feel resentful of that. You could feel guilty that that's the case. But you found ways to use those constraints to your advantage, and just tremendous grit and creativity and imagination and presence on your part. Where did that come from? How did you become this mom and this woman? What were you processing and thinking in your own heart and mind as you're engaging with them in those moments, in those ways, over the course of their childhoods?
Oh, that's a really complex question. I think for me, like, I became a parent at 22 when Marc-Andre's eldest sister was born. And it was under really difficult circumstances. We were in a car accident about 10 days before she was born. Somebody drove through a stop sign and crashed into our vehicle. And as a result of that, I was ill and back in hospital for about a week after she was born. We lost our vehicle. We lost our means of income. We were evicted from our apartment. We even ended up having to go to the food bank. It was a really traumatic introduction to parenthood. And we were living in Montreal at the time. So I had no extended family around for support, really. And so it's really kind of a do or die situation, right? It's not just adapting to parenting and figuring out, what that looks like, for you and what that is going to, how that's, your values and ethics and philosophy around parenting, but it's just raw survival on many levels. So it really is kind of that, at one point in the film, Marc-Andre says something about when things are getting hairy, you can either lose it or pull it together. And, I think that's a bit like what becoming a parent was for me. It was like, you can either lose it or you can pull it together. And so you look at ways to survive within the reality that you're in, to hopefully find your way to a better place. But within that, not lose the day-to-day joys and the day-to-day connection with your child, because we can get lost in that, right? Like, you can get lost in the day-to-day stresses and just lose connection with our child. And, I think that's sort of a terrible place to be. So those challenges and difficulties, I think they taught me to, as much as parenting could be difficult, especially when you're in that survival mode, you could still sit in the grass in the park and play with your child. You can still talk to them and engage with them while you're feeding them in the high chair. These are things that you can still do. In fact, they're more important to do than ever because they're what ground you in the most important things of that relationship. And so I think that's, in kind of a nutshell, is what sort of set me on that path of my parenting philosophy, was not allowing circumstance to steal the joy of the relationship of my children away from me.
What a defining period. Only powers superior to ours understand precisely the complex interplay of all those dynamics within your family and in producing Marc-Andre as the man that he became. But I'm so glad that you shared that, because I had obviously had no idea about that, those formative stages. And what would you say to someone who's listening who recognizes in their own life constraints that they wish weren't there, and they feel torn between sort of succumbing or becoming bitter or continuing to make the best of what they've got and find a way forward? How would you distill what you learned from that period for someone listening today?
For sure. Everyone has a different story. But I think some of the things that really have stood out to me, like even in the context of this pandemic for the last 2 years, was hearing people say things like, I didn't sign up for parenting during the pandemic. I didn't sign up for this. And I think, frankly, when you become a parent, you have no idea what's coming your way and you have no control over it. Whether it's job loss, marriage breakdown, health challenges, a global pandemic, some parts of the world, they're facing war. To say that we didn't sign up for something, is, I think, in some ways indicative of how in North America, we have this sense that we should be able to control our destiny because, we're this sort of first world, Canada and the US and whatnot, that, we have so many things in our life that we can control. Being adaptive is so important. Being at peace with the things that are outside of your control. In fact, find ways to make the best of it and be creative, and move forward in that because there's so many things that we can't change, but there's so many things that we can affect control of in our day-to-day life. And at the end of the day, that's what's going to stay with you. What's going to stay with you is either that, you were like the most miserable parent during 2 years of pandemic, or that you came up with a multitude of other ways to engage with your children that you will never forget. Right? That's a positive. So, I feel like we always kind of have a choice in that matter. And it comes down to the narrative that we choose to tell ourselves. And one of the narratives I tell myself is typically somebody always has it worse than I do. So, let's just get on with getting on with things.
Do what you can with what you have.
And that often is what leads to further opportunity.
That's very interesting. Because I think we wouldn't necessarily think that. You might think that mindset would just kind of get you through the tough period, but you're actually saying it can lead to opportunities that might not otherwise present themselves.
Yeah, because I think positivity creates positivity.
Turning to a topic that a lot of folks that I interacted with on social media were interested in hearing about was simply what it was like for you as his mom when he was off on these extreme adventures. What was it like for you when he was off doing something especially audacious?
Well, it depends where he was. When he was further afield, Patagonia or Europe, if he was in the Rockies in Alberta, I was definitely more disconnected or less aware of whatever he was undertaking. I would typically find out after the fact. He would say, Mom, I soloed Robson, it was awesome, or I've just come back from Torrey Egger, it was great, or, whatever it was. But when he was tackling things closer to home, that was a lot more difficult. So when he was soloing Slessie in the winter, I can see Slessie from my house. And so, I could look out and see this mountain and know that he's on it. And so at that point, my own internal clock kicks in. When can I expect to hear from him? Is everything going all right up there? And so it definitely, like, how I dealt with whatever he was doing, had a lot to do with sort of how close he was to home and my expectation of when I, should be expecting to hear from him. That was something that I was dealing with, though, from a young age, from 14, 15 years old, when he started to go into the mountains with other climbers. I had to make that transition from being a parent who is very hands-on with their child's day-to-day activities to being very much outside of it. And that is a really difficult transition to make when your child's 14 or 15 years old. Like, if you think of most parents who are involved with their child's activities or athletic endeavors, even if they're competing, say, at a very high degree, like this is a child who's, on the trajectory to potentially going to the Olympics one day, they're still a parent driving the car, to the arena. They are, fully involved in every part of that activity. But when Marc-Andre started to go out into the mountains, that was really not something I could facilitate. I just simply couldn't facilitate it. Like, I don't have the skill set. I didn't have the time. I didn't know what I was doing. And it was a conscious release in the sense of giving him the space to go and do that with the people he could do it with. And he would go out into the mountains to go climb a mountain that I was only vaguely aware of what this mountain was. And he would be going with people who I didn't know. And his return time would potentially be a little bit vague. Like, we could be back Tuesday evening or Wednesday lunchtime. It's going to be this, this time frame. that they would be back. And these are places where there's no cell phone coverage. So that is a really difficult place to be as a parent when your child's 14 or 15 years old. And so that was, as he got older, as he was traveling in other parts of the world, I mean, to some degree, I'd already kind of worked through that when he was much younger.
How did you manage the worry and concern when he was off on these adventures?
Well, I think I mentioned in the movie that people would sometimes say to me, well, don't you worry? And I would say that to me, that's one of the stupidest questions a person can ask a parent about their kids, no matter what their kid does. Like, what parent does not worry about their kid? Like, even sitting on the couch playing video games, parents are worrying like, oh my gosh, are their brain training too much? They're sitting there playing video games. Parents worry about their kids walking to school, riding a bike. They worry about them getting on a bus to go participate in a sporting event. And sometimes for good reason, right? There's been some awful tragedies that you hear about in the news. Yeah, I worried for sure about what Marc-Andre was doing. And it was an internal self-analytical process to a large degree, because if I allowed my worry to lead me to hold him back or prevent him from doing the thing that he was passionate about and also extremely good at, then who am I serving at the end of the day? Like, to hold somebody else back, to give myself a little bit more internal peace, as a parent, I think is an incredibly selfish thing to do. And so, one of the ways that I dealt with my worry was to talk about Marc-Andre, not in this like guilty way, like, oh, I'm so worried, feel guilty about how I'm feeling, but more like about, help me understand what you're doing. Help me understand how you take steps to be safe out there. One of the conversations that we had with him as parents, that's Marc-Andre's father and I as well, was, to have him just really work through his own sense of empowerment in that, when you're a kid, you're used to deferring to adults. And, we said with him, like, we don't know who these adults are. We don't know their skill set out there in the mountains. We don't know that they would always make the best decision. And said, and you don't know that either. So, this is where if you're going to go out there and you're going to do these things, you really need to make those calls for yourself, right? You need to make sure, like, you need to not be afraid to say no and to say, I'm not going to do that. So, because when you're out there, it's not just a case of assuming that because someone's an adult, they are better prepared or better equipped than you are. And he demonstrated that actually when he was 15 and he went on he joined a group of people to go climb. I think it was the Border Peaks, although somebody else would have to verify that for me. And they were supposed to be gone a couple of days. And because Marc-Andre was the strongest climber in the group, even though he was by far the youngest, he was given the lead on each pitch. And I guess after about a day and a half, he concluded that the pace in which they were doing this was too slow, that he would lead and then several people would follow and then they would move on to the next one. And so he concluded they would never do it within the time frame that they had set out to do it in. And so he was the one who told the group that they needed to just call it quits and head home. And so they deferred to him. And so that was sort of the first, to me, concrete example, not of him being bigger than his boots per se, but of him using his own judgment to make the right call. And those are the things that helped allay my worries. So as much as I was concerned, as much as I was always to some degree anxious when he was out there in the mountains, and I was always anticipating him coming back, I also had this voice saying, you know that he's capable, you know he makes good decisions. And so that was sort of my process.
Well, as a parent of 10 and 12-year-olds, and my 10-year-old is a budding climber, I can certainly relate to just, the worries we have every day about our kids, and how rewarding that must have been for you to see him actually be in high stakes situations and be able to have the presence of mind to make good decisions, and how that must have fortified your confidence in him.
I think it's really important to be an observer.
What do you mean?
To be an observer of your children, right? Some people want to have a one size fits all. When you're 7, you're allowed to do this. When you're 10, you're allowed to do that. When you're 15, you're allowed to do that. But I think you if we're good observers of our children, we can see what their capabilities are. So when Marc-Andre was 6 or 7, I recognized he was a kid had great sense of direction and a really good presence of mind. And so I would allow him to get on his bike and go run errands around town. And he handled it extremely well. And that's not a decision I would have made at that time, at that age, for all of my children, because they had different skill sets and talents and capabilities. And there was maybe responsibilities that I allowed his older sister to have at a certain age that, I waited a bit longer for Marc-Andre. And that was just on basis of observing and recognizing sort of where they were at developmentally and what their unique skill set and talents are. And I think we need to, as parents, be adaptable and responsive to that, because we can end up frustrating a child if we say it's black and white. You're allowed to do X at such an age. I think it should be more like, we'll just make those decisions based on where you're at and take it from there.
Well, my guess is that the being an observer part that you've just shared with us will be part of how you would answer the next question. I don't know, but I'll guess. And I'll throw this out. You said in the documentary, as any parent knows, raising children is a tough job, but I'm grateful that at least God granted me the grace to understand this about my son, to not stand in the way of his passion for the mountains. He said that at his celebration of life service in Squamish. And the question I want to ask is, how did you summon the wisdom and courage to parent Marc-Andre as you did, and to not stand in the way of his passion for the mountains? I think that observation bit is part of it, because you saw his competency develop over time. What else was involved for you?
I think, if you're emotionally connected to someone, whether that's your kids or somebody else, you desire what's best for them. You want for them what they want for themselves. So like on an emotional level, I couldn't have stood in the way of what he most desired, of what he was passionate about, of what clearly made him feel alive, like in the most profound way. It would have been extremely selfish for me to do that. And so, emotionally, I couldn't have brought myself to do that. I suppose the other aspect of it, is that, that piece is a bit just about being adaptive and letting your children become who they're intended to be.
What do you think gets in the way of we parents understanding the kind of human that our child is and nurturing them along those natural lines?
That's a really good question. I think sometimes our own ideologies get in the way, perhaps our echo chamber of our social group get in the way, where there's these external voices that say this is what your child should do with their life or who they should be. I think of my husband talks about growing up in a pretty conservative community. Something like doing what Marc-Andre did with his life wouldn't have even been on the radar. The community had these expectations of you are going to be a farmer or a pastor or a tradesperson, and you're going to get married at a certain age and so on and so forth. And that works out great for some people. It doesn't work out so great for others. But sometimes I think what can get in the way of parents really embracing who their children are, who they're made to be, who they're wired to be, can be those societal and community expectations, those external voices saying this is who your child should be. And I once heard someone say that their parenting philosophy was they felt like, children should be directed like an arrow, like direct your child like an arrow. And I think it might be a quote from the Bible, but I can't verify that. And I remember at the time thinking that's got to be one of the worst things I've ever heard. And I understand there was a loving intention behind it, but my thought was, I don't know what direction my child should go, right? Like they are their own unique, autonomous individual. And as much as we like to think we know our children, every individual is more complex than we are able to understand just from interacting with somebody externally. And they have their own thought life and, they have unique abilities and talents that we may not completely understand. And so if you decide that you're going to direct your child like an arrow because you think they should be a doctor or they should be an accountant or they should go into some other career or lifestyle, you could be entirely misdirecting that arrow and, down the road causing this real disconnect, for that child between who they really are and the life that they've been kind of directed into, and I think that does create an emotional, moral, spiritual, mental distress in people. So, and my daughter is working on her master's degree in counseling. And one of the things that really struck me is that she says a good counselor doesn't tell somebody what they should do with their life and doesn't, kind of point out what the issues are in their life. A good counselor helps that person discover for themselves what they already know. And I think essentially that's what we should be doing as parents, is helping our children discover for themselves who they already are and kind of facilitating that process.
I can tell you that in the work I do as a coach, I would say the vast majority of people that have an opportunity to support and will come alongside are in some stages of trying to figure out who they are, because they came into adulthood with either an inadequate understanding or were sort of given by a family of origin, a community, a culture, an impression of who they ought to be. And you mentioned the emotional, psychological, and other forms of distress that come along when a child isn't helped to discover who they are. I see that every day. And I'm not a therapist, but I can tell you when people begin to discover who they actually are, as opposed to who they were led to believe they are through family of origin, culture, societal pressures, the immense relief and joy they begin to discover as they meet themselves for the first time, which is part of why, in my estimation, the gift you gave Marc-Andre of coming alongside him with curiosity that led you to mutual observations about the kind of human that he was, and then allowed you to support him along those lines, is such a tremendous gift. I don't know of many adults I've come across who don't have some form of pain associated with an insufficient understanding of the kind of human they are. And in a sense, that leads us then to put on costumes and adopt ways of living that aren't ours, which is inherently distressing. So I just wanted to corroborate that because I see that every day. That's not theoretical, what you're saying. That's real world stuff that impacts not only individual humans, but everyone with whom they come into contact. I think part of Marc-Andre's, I think it was Heavy Duty, who himself is a character. Like, I'd love to meet this guy, Heavy Duty. But, he said that he's a man out of his own time, isn't he? That's why he's so special. He's a breath of fresh air. And maybe that's part of what some people were responding to, was the fact that Marc-Andre was so fully himself. And today that feels so weird, to encounter someone who's so comfortably possessed of themselves.
Like, as a child, Marc-Andre didn't easily fit into the norms. Like, he didn't easily fit into the classroom setting. Team sports were definitely not his jam. He didn't have the attention span or the interest for it. And he had unique interests. He was this super active imagination and mind, and he read everything. And so he would just bring up the wildest topics out of the blue. And, and I think for him for a time, especially going through his teen years, there was that sense of like wanting to belong more, wanting to be more connected to a peer group. And he was also like 2 years younger than everybody else in his grade when he did go back to school. So, there was that piece of it as well. Like, he'd sort of gone from homeschooling, into the war zone that is grade 8 when he was 2 years younger than everybody else in that grade. So,
oh, wow. Yeah. And that's a big 2 years in that phase of stage of life. Yeah.
It is really big. Yeah. And, of course, like, he was still like probably 95 pounds and, just this small kid with this crazy energy. Right. And so for sure he had to work through his identity in those years. Like, even the most self-possessed adult has had to work through that at some point. As a parent, it wasn't this, like, I saw this clear-cut superhighway to the horizon in front of me where I knew we were going to arrive. It was route finding, right? It was recognizing, firstly, that, okay, we can't really continue doing homeschool at this point. It was great for a time, but I'm not going to kid myself that I can teach somebody chemistry and algebra. And also to, there's just that aspect of like, other aspects of being in a community of peers that are important. And also recognizing that trying to teach somebody who's like very restless ADHD and bug him all day to get his work done. And on top of that, all the other aspects of parenting, as well as we really need to distance myself from being his teacher and his mother. So that was one thing that I recognized. Then when he was in school, I recognized that the first school he went into at high school was not a good fit for him. And he wasn't exactly thriving there. So then it was like, look for different options. So we did find sort of a private Christian school that he went to. And he, in many ways, like it was a lot better. But like I said in the film, it was more like minimum security incarceration as opposed to, maximum security incarceration. It was still, for him, a form of incarceration.
You got more time in the yard, huh?
He got more time in the yard. The guards were a little bit more indulgent and understanding. And, he was well liked by the teachers and the kids. But it was still, a couple years of torture, stuffing his climbing gear in the attic until he got his assignments done, until he could graduate. Again, and now I had a 16-year-old graduate who, despite being a highly intelligent young kid, was clearly not going to go on to university anytime soon, because we were all completely relieved that he didn't have any more school assignments to do. And there was that question of what is he going to do now? So of course he loved climbing, but at that point it wasn't like a foregone decision that climbing would become his career, his future ultimately. It was still just something he loved to do. But he was working as a drywaller, actually, for that year after graduation. And I remember just sitting with him going through they weren't easy conversations for Marc-Andre, where I was like, what do you really want? Right? I don't see this as a long-term thing for you. Like you're just kind of putting in time right now. And he finally said, well, I really want to go to Squamish and I want to really start climbing. And so the next step was to pack his stuff into the car and move him to Squamish, where he was renting a room. And he was 17 at that point, and he had a lot to learn about living independently at 17 years old, and plus I wasn't paying the bills for him. I wasn't in a position to do that. So he was supporting himself as well. So there was a process of nurturing him through that piece as well, but giving him the space he needed to make his own mistakes. And that was alluded to in the film. He for a time was in the party scene, and a part of that could have been response to some breakdown in our family because his dad and I divorced, and there was pain there, obviously. But I also knew that even without that he was going to test the limits of most things because that's who he was wired to be. And it was more a case of just maintaining the relationship, maintaining the connection, and helping guide him through that to some degree. There was a point where I saw that switch where he started to get really serious about climbing, about investing in those skills. And I remember having a conversation with him where I said, you could have gone to Squamish and just been a pretty okay climber who partied a good portion of the time. I said, but you've become someone who is investing like hours and hours of your day in this thing that you want to become a professional at. So he was working and he was spending the rest of his time improving his climbing skills. And he would go up into the mountains. He would bivvy in a cave somewhere. He would go up and down the Chief repeatedly. Like that's just, I just get tired thinking about it. But, and I said to him, you're investing as much time and effort into what you're doing. I said, as if you were in university going after that degree. And I said, I'm just really proud to see you do that, because you're doing that without the benefit of coaches and teachers and deadlines and the structure that tends to help people stay on track and get to, that goal that they're trying to achieve. And I said, you're doing that on your own. And I'm just really proud of you. And I think that meant a lot for him to hear me say that, that encouragement and that support. But, that just goes back to, again, there was no superhighway. There was no, I clearly know where I'm going with this child. I clearly have this vision. It's more like building a ship at sea, right? You're just working your way through each twist and turn and doing what you hope is your best for your child.
You used the phrase route finder earlier, and that conjured to mind for me how you weren't working off of a pre-drawn map. You were instead employing a compass that had on as its compass points things like stay curious, don't believe that I know what his path ought to be, remain observant, don't sabotage his interests and wants in the interest of preserving my own sense of well-being. Those might be some of the compass points on the compass that you were using with him, and it served him so well. And then the feedback that you gave him must have been an extremely powerful tool. You said it made him feel really good. You helped him see what he was doing. Even though he was the one doing it, he probably didn't see it as clearly until you'd let him know, hey, you're pursuing this like it's your job. You're pursuing this like you want that degree at university. And I bet that gave him a real sense of, I don't know if this makes any sense, but personal esprit de corps and a sense of, yeah, that's right. And it brings to mind also for me just how critical it is that we're able to know what we want, because he was someone for whom many of the traditional paths were untenable, and he might have appeared disorganized and overly energetic trying to walk those paths. But as soon as a central focusing desire came into the picture, he was as meticulous and as committed, if not more, than anyone else has come along before him. He didn't have to think of words like discipline and I've got to use my time well, for example, which may have been challenges in his previous chapter because of the environments he was in, and his energies weren't aligned with the thing that he really wanted. But as soon as his energies got aligned with the thing that he really wanted, all these other things came alongside that previously there hadn't been much evidence of. It's tremendous.
Yeah. But I think too, he did definitely like display all those characteristics. And I think one of the temptations as a parent when you have a kid who's like highly disorganized and easily distracted, the kid who loses the homework and can't remember where they put the item, and he lost a lot of items in his lifetime, is to compensate by doing things for them, right? Or to get on their case a lot, right? And that's a difficult path to walk too, because eventually that person has to learn personal responsibility. They have to develop coping mechanisms or strategies to deal with that aspect of themselves, right? So one of the things that as a parent was like, I would almost like offer Marc-Andre to some degree, like talk therapy, like talk him through strategies for things, but not do things for him as much as possible. So like, I know it wasn't always easy for him to get the paperwork together, to get a passport in time, to get all his flights organized, to go somewhere like El Chalten. And sometimes he was like scrambling and like having to think outside the box to solve a problem that he just hadn't anticipated or planned for. I would be there to be like, yeah, wow, that's difficult. Good for you for doing this or that. But, as a parent, I feel like it's important to hold back from jumping in and being like, well, I could do that for you. I know how to get that done, because then we just kind of end up like crippling our kid in their ability to learn how to cope with that aspect of themselves, right? And so it is kind of a tenuous line to walk. You don't want them to crash and burn per se, but sometimes like a little bit of crashing and burning is okay, because that's how they learn to manage those things for themselves, right?
Yeah, little crashes along the way can prevent major crashes later on.
Yeah, exactly.
I'd like to talk about some of the lessons that we can glean from Marc-Andre's life. And in the documentary, at the service in Squamish, the camera pans across an image that someone had made and put on an easel, and it said, "Live like Marc-Andre." What does it mean to you to live like Marc-Andre?
I think living like Marc-Andre is embracing the philosophy by which he had come to live by. And I remember some of them like every single day. And one was, he would say, you only experience something for the first time once. I mean, that sounds so simplistic, but by that, he means like that hike that you're taking that you've never been on before, you will not have this first time again. So be in the moment and absorb all of it. But that can apply to so many things, like this day with your child. You will not have this day again. This birthday dinner that you're having, or these other moments that you're experiencing. Many of these are these one time only moments. And he had become like a real master of absorbing everything that those moments had to give. And he would say, like, he was very intentional about making memories. And, you know, when you think back, like I think back on the things that have made a significant memory in my life that I can go back to and kind of just relive and embrace and experience the positive feelings that come from that. They are those things. They are that like hike to Mount Robson. They are those walks and talks with friends. They are those birthday dinners, even the ones that went sideways where someone set the cake on fire. These are the moments that I think build resiliency in our lives and give our life meaning and context. And that's a huge thing about living like Marc-Andre, is like, don't be living without living, you know, sitting on your phone, scanning social media, you know, doing your work half-hearted, going through the motions, and then looking back on your week and not being able to remember anything that you did that stood out to you as meaningful at all. Like that would be living like Marc-Andre, is to step out of that. And another one is like work through our fears. You know, the first time Marc-Andre went on a climbing wall when he was 6 years old, he cried. He was scared, right? But at the same time, he had this like incredible desire to live fully. And he would do the things over and over again that he wanted to achieve, right? So this is the kid who would build the bike jump and go over it multiple times until he finally got it. You know, he was willing to invest the time and effort, essentially in blood, sweat, and tears, in the hard things to get to the things that he wanted to get to, right? He didn't just live in sort of a daydream of, well, I'd like to do this eventually, but never really put in the effort to get there. You know, he was intentional about putting in the effort to get there. And he was intentional about having fun. I mean, I think that's something too. We can get lost in seriousness, especially, you know, I understand that the effort to be an elite athlete requires a lot of dedication and mental focus. But if you're not having fun, if you're not able to, you know, just to laugh and relax, then you're also missing out on an aspect of life. And he was just really good at that. He was really good at having fun. I think that came through in the movie. You know, he was able to be lighthearted. And another aspect of living like Marc-Andre too, I'd say that in all the time he spent in the mountains, you know, I think he worked through a lot of things in his own life. And one of the things that really stood out to me was he did not have time for anger and resentment in his heart to other people. Like you really just wouldn't hear him say mean or negative things about people. You know, when he was getting some like fairly negative social media feedback, like when he was first climbing in the Rockies and people were like, who is this guy and what is he doing? And they didn't like sort of the solos he was doing. He just shut it down. Like he wasn't going to engage with it. You know, he didn't want to have these like negative interactions with people, and he just didn't want to be negative towards people in general. And you'd rarely hear him say an unkind thing about someone. And I think that's something too, like in this age of, you know, angst and anger and polarization on social media and some of the terrible things that people say to each other and the anger that they hold in their hearts to people sometimes that they don't even really know. It's such a sad waste of our emotional energy. And that would be another aspect of, I'd say, living like Marc-Andre.
Those are awesome. And one of the things that sticks out to me, what you just said, was his commitment to fun. That might not be too much of a stretch to say he was committed to having fun. And anything that might get in the way of that would be, it was like a value for him.
Absolutely.
And I mean, that's something I would like to take to heart more too, because you can just get so wrapped up in the nuts and bolts, feeding the beast of your life, and fail to just pause and have fun for its own sake. And it sounds like he elevated that almost to the point of a core value.
I would say so, yeah.
One of the things that impacted me deeply from his story, and actually in 2022, I've kind of labeled it the year of being bold and being me, and the being me part really comes from Marc-Andre's story. I've been on this path of attempting to become more me for a number of years, but when I saw his story and I saw how single-mindedly he appeared to do things his way, and to see the amazing things he was able to accomplish and the beauty he brought into the world as a result of doing things his way, which he wasn't, I don't think, attempting to introduce beauty into the world to the rest of us, but that was a collateral benefit of the way he pursued doing things his way. So that impacted me a lot, to the point that, you know, this year is kind of all about that for me. He seemed to embrace his personal sovereignty in a way that many of us fail to. And I know this is important to you because we've had previous conversations. What do you think helped them do that? And what keeps more of us from doing that in our own lives?
I think for Marc-Andre, it was a progression for sure for him to get to that place. As he became, I think the term is like self-actualization, but as that became more and more of a thing for him, he was more and more that sense of peace with who he was. And so it sort of creates this like self-reinforcement. To some degree, he was always that kind of person. He was a self-directed learner. He kind of had that mentality already. As far as, living that out authentically as a sovereign person, I think we spent a lot of time as a family just talking about what that looked like, and we would look at all kinds of different scenarios. One of the things that we were homeschooling as a family was we just spent a lot of time unpacking ideas and thinking for yourself and being yourself and being true to yourself, and not in this like absence of knowledge, or context, but, definitely thinking about, who we are as our own person. And the benefit that actually gives is like when we're honest and true to ourselves, in a way that allows and frees other people to be honest and true to themselves. So we're actually not, it may seem selfish to say, I'm just going to be me. But in fact, it's less selfish because then it frees other people to let go of the baggage that they're hanging on to, to try and conform to something that they're not. But we talked about what that meant to be sort of a sovereign person quite a bit, and that was one of the benefits of homeschooling, was that we would read these books and we would talk about these ideas and we would kind of unpack those, and, the dishes wouldn't get done and maybe something else would slide. But, this process of really thinking things through, I think became ingrained in the kids. And they're all kind of like these deep thinkers, and not inclined to base their sense of self or even their just opinions about things in general on what is sort of the popular notion out there or what other people think that they should or shouldn't do. So I'd have to say, we're talking about Marc-Andre, but I'd have to say each one of my children to become very unique individuals who I just learn from every day.
I love what you said about how when we commit to being who we are, it frees other people up to be themselves. I think it's a simple statement, but it is profound, I think, in its impact when that reality exists in the world. In dysfunctional relationships consist at least of two people entangled too much and being over and under responsible for each other and those kinds of things. And I used to be somewhat skeptical of the idea of, being true to yourself and following your heart. And part of that was because I came from a fairly standard evangelical Christian background that taught me that, well, your heart's wicked. Don't trust that. That whatever springs from there ought to be held at arm's length and skeptically at that. But I've come to realize that, being healthily suspicious of my heart and also understanding what's in my heart and trusting it are not mutually exclusive. And that when I continue to persist in becoming who I believe I'm made to be, it does free other people up around me to persist in becoming who they were made to be. And some of that is simply because they have to respond to the fact that I'm committed to becoming who I was made to be. It creates a dynamic between us now that they have to figure out what they're going to do with. So there's so much in that statement. What are the costs of failing to fully acknowledge and own our personal sovereignty as far as you can tell?
Well, I think the ability to be content, happy, have true and meaningful relationships. When we are not our true selves, then whoever we're engaged with in relationship, they're not engaged with a completely authentic individual. So they're not getting the full experience of who you are. And so there's going to be like a lack of transparency and depth in those relationships. I think there's often that disconnect can just lead to that sense of disjointedness with our life and the world that we've created for ourselves, or the world that we're living in, where, we've learned to go through the motions of what the expectations are, but, we know that we're not okay. And, there's a lot of pressure for people, like whatever situation they're in. Like, it seems like social media has just made that so much worse because there's this bombardment of messaging around what we should look like, what we should be like, what kind of parents we should be, and I think that has sort of facilitated sort of this mental distress, this emotional distress that people have because they haven't given themselves the permission just to put all of that aside and figure out who they are. And in this really simplistic example I would give is like, some years ago, there was this like craze around Justin Bieber. Everybody loved Justin Bieber. He was this prodigy musician, kid, singer. And then just like things tend to go, in entertainment and the world is, whoever you love the most is who they love to hate the most. And so there was this big flip. And all of a sudden, it was the flavor of the day was to hate Justin Bieber. And so if you loved Justin Bieber last week, this week you're supposed to hate Justin Bieber. And I remember talking to my kids about that. I'm talking about my youngest because he was like a teenager at the time. And just like, why? Why would you love Justin Bieber one week and hate him the next week just because these external voices tell you to? Like, what do you like? If you like the music, you like the music and you have nothing to apologize for. And you don't need to get on some bandwagon with everybody else to be part of the group, right? And, and I said, and even aside from that, I said, we still need to remember that Justin Bieber is not some idea that's floating around out there. He's an actual human being. And he's a young kid. And he's experienced this meteoric rise to fame and everything that comes with that. And could you imagine being 16, 17, 18 and working out all the angst of youth in that kind of setting? So even if you don't like his music, the right response is to have some compassion, at least. But, I think like to get back to your question of sovereignty of who we are, when we get caught up in groupthink and embrace that rather than stepping back and saying, okay, who am I? What do I believe? And then owning it through the lens of compassion to others. We are just going to be so much more at peace with who we are. And I think that's something that other people need to see, right? They need to see that it's okay not to embrace the group thing, to kind of like be pulled into that and controlled by it.
It brings to mind something I've thought of too, which is that when we fail to allow who we really are to be available to the world, then we sabotage our own ability to grow and learn, because to your point earlier, when you said that if we're not really who we are, then the people with whom we're relating are interacting with a counterfeit version of us in some sense. And when we fail to own who we are and bring it into the world with vulnerability and courage, then we stunt our own growth and learning, because the person we're presenting to the world is not really us. And so what we're projecting into the world is interacting with the world and getting some feedback, but it's not aligned with the real us. And I think it takes courage to do that, to allow, who you believe yourself truly to be available to the world, because not everyone's going to love that.
And I think it's important to be open to that process of self-discovery. So, I can think as a parent, for instance, there's this laundry list of things that has been idealized as what makes a good parent. So when you sincerely want to do a good job as a parent, you internalize these things, and you try to execute on them. And I'll just give an example of one of the things you're supposed to do with your children as a good parent is arts and crafts. I remember doing something with Marc-Andre when he was about 4.5. We spent half the afternoon building a rocket ship out of a milk carton, which is not something I enjoy doing. I don't like glue and scissors particularly. I'm not particularly good at these things, but I was doing it for my kid. And so we built this thing, it's done. And I'm like, step back and look at it. And I'm like, so what do you think? And he said, well, let's launch it. And I was like, oh no, we can't launch it. It's an actual milk carton. It's like, you need
that's great.
He's like, well, why can't we? He's like, what are we missing? I said, well, rocket fuel. And he said, well, where do we get rocket fuel? And when it dawned on him that he had spent half the afternoon with glue and scissors and a milk carton to create something that was useless, he wasn't particularly happy about the outcome at all. And so for me at that moment, I was like, you know what? I don't like arts and crafts. Seems like my kid doesn't particularly like arts and crafts, but we all like science experiments. So let's go for that. And when I see another parent do some beautiful arts and crafts with their children, I'm happy for them, but I'm just going to let go of the guilt because I'm not being true to myself as a parent, as a person, if I'm trying to do these things because of some, outward ideal. And, so that's just sort of that example, that process of like, you try different things in life and you recognize, oh, this is a good fit for me, or this is not a good fit for me. And it's okay to let go of those things that don't work for you, right? And to embrace those things that do, and just to move ahead with that, whatever capacity that is, whether it's your career, whether it's a parent, whether it's the, how you choose to spend your time, recreationally. It's okay just to, that process of discovery, figure out who you are and embracing that and letting go of the ones that aren't. So if there's a parent out there listening who hates glue and scissors, I would say like, it's okay to let go of that.
Mm-hmm. That's a great story. I just love the mental image I have of him realizing suddenly this thing's not going to blast off, just being so ticked.
He was.
Where do we get rocket fuel? That's great.
Yeah.
I'd like to personalize this a little bit to you and Marc-Andre's impact upon you. How do you live differently as a result of the way that Marc-Andre lived and the example he set?
I am definitely more intentional about investing my time in the things that are valuable to me. So I'm sure, as as a parent of 2 kids, and you can spend a lot of time doing things for everybody else. I was fairly duty driven as a person. So as much as there's things that I enjoy doing, my obligations to others tended to come first, or that was sort of my ethic. And, after losing Marc-Andre, there was 2 things that really stood out to me. One was I went back to work almost right away, partly because I didn't know what to do with myself, but also because the people who I was working with were carrying the weight of the workload without me there. And there was this big conference that was being organized, and I was kind of spearheading it. And I knew that if I wasn't there, that they would have to figure this out on their own. And they just they didn't have the experience to do that and would have been overwhelmed. So I went back to work what was one of the things I wanted to make sure I saw that through. And yet that was really, really difficult. Like I would just drive to work and then cry in the parking lot and try to pull myself together. And I saw the conference through and I started getting patted on the back for doing a good job, but I just fell apart after. And one of the things I concluded was it wasn't a worthwhile investment of my time emotionally. And that was something that, when we go through something difficult in our life, if we have to step out and take care of ourselves, that will create some difficulties for other people. But at the end of the day, I think they probably would have figured out the conference, and it would have been better for me to spend my time, working through the impact my grief was having on me, rather than being so focused on, I must deliver on this work thing. And another aspect too, is I was very much trying to hold things together by just maintaining the same routine. And one of those was going to church on Sundays, and it hadn't been a particularly fulfilling thing for some time, but, I was kind of committed to it. But then about 3 or 4 months after losing Marc-Andre, I just left one day and I just realized I can't do this anymore. It's not only is it not helping me, it's costing me something every time I go. And it's not saying there was anything particularly wrong with that church community or whatnot, but for me, it was making me feel worse rather than making me feel better. And I stopped to ask myself, what do I need right now? And it was a so much better investment of my time to go hiking in the local hillsides in the forest for that 2 hours than to be sitting in a service. And so I became intentional about what are the things that help me manage, my pain and grief, what makes me feel alive, what makes me feel connected to Marc-Andre, what makes me feel connected to the people that I care about, and just be intentional about doing those things and letting go of sort of the obligatory things of life more, and speaking up and saying that I want to do those things.
You doubled down even more on what you wanted and discovering your own way in his absence.
Yeah, definitely.
How has Marc-Andre's death impacted the rest of your family, dad, siblings?
Oh, well, each person I think would have to speak for themselves. It's incredibly painful. There's different types of losses for each person. For Marc-Andre's siblings, it's a loss of that sibling relationship. For each person, it's been profoundly life-changing. There's all these trite sayings around grief, like closure and healing and whatnot. And that seems to imply that at some point, you just sort of close the door on grief and now you just move on with your life. But that is not the case. It's a permanent part of who you are. And it kind of redefines and shapes you as a person. And it's more like you learn to live with it. It becomes this sort of constant companion. The waves of it and the intensity of those waves become less. The presence of it never goes away. And I may not talk about Marc-Andre every day, but I think about Marc-Andre every day. And I would say the same is true for his siblings and, for his grandparents, for his dad, for Brett, for the people in his life who loved him very much. And actually, today is the day, 4 years to the day that I came back from Juneau without Marc-Andre. And, it's, I always recognize that this particular week, even if nothing else is like particularly going on in my life, there's this heaviness for this week. And that will always be the case.
My sister lost her husband in 2015 after a 3-year cancer battle. And, I didn't know precisely how to support and love her through it. But I was always curious how she was doing. And I would sometimes apologize when I would ask how she was doing, because I was afraid that it was bringing Brian, her husband, and the grief back to mind. And she said, never apologize. I mean, his loss and my love for him and the life we had together is never not on my heart or on my mind.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's not like if somebody brings up Marc-Andre, that all of a sudden I'm reminded that I've lost Marc-Andre. I'm reminded that I'm grieving. That's already there. There's no sudden, if somebody brings Marc-Andre up. I think what's difficult is when people bring up the cause or the circumstances around losing Marc-Andre. So I'll give you an example. We were snowshoeing probably about a month ago with the outdoor club, and we met another group of people up there and just started chatting. And these guys actually are ice climbers. And so just through that conversation, it came up that Marc-Andre was my son, and they knew him. They knew of him. At least one person had climbed with him, had ice climbed with him, which is kind of a cool connection and nice to hear about. But another person in the group kind of persisted in asking me about what happened to Marc-Andre and Ryan. Did they ever find out for sure if it was a collapsing serac or an avalanche? Is that? And finally I just said, I don't want to talk to you about this. Like, I will talk to you about Marc-Andre. I love talking about Marc-Andre, but I don't want to talk to you about what caused him and Ryan to die. Like, that's painful for me. For him, it was just this sort of curiosity. But for me, it's the worst thing ever. And I think that is probably one of the things that I found the most difficult, is people want to just ask questions around the accident in Alaska. And they sort of have this curiosity around what happened, or they would ask about the search and rescue and how that was going, or, was anything going to come of it? And these were not things that were easy to talk about in casual conversation. So talking about Marc-Andre, absolutely. Talking about how he died is not something that I want to revisit.
What's one thing you hope we'll all take away from your story?
I'd say invest in the people you love. You'll never regret spending time with someone. You'll only regret the time you didn't spend with them.
Simple to say. I think I'm going to go sledding with my boys tonight, Michelle. I've been holding off on doing that, but tonight's the night to go sledding with my boys. They keep asking me to. Yeah.
Absolutely. Sounds like a blast.
We're landing the plane here. Is there anything else you'd like to add beyond that final question about what you hope we all take away? Anything else you'd like to add to the listeners?
One question that you had mentioned that someone brought up on one of the Squamish pages was, what would I do differently given the outcome from Marc-Andre? Like, would I do something differently as a parent? And that's been brought up quite a few times. Even my mother said, well, do you wish you hadn't encouraged him to climb? And, I think that kind of makes me think a little bit of the butterfly effect. Like, you can go back and say, well, if I change this, what would that look like? If I change that, what would that look like? But I always come back to this place of Marc-Andre lived the life he was meant to live. And it's not so much that I encouraged him to climb. It was more like I allowed him to pursue something that he loved and was incredibly good at, and supported him in the decision that he made. If I could go back and encourage him to take up accountancy, to do something different. I mean, I always get this sense that it would not be a good outcome, that he would miss out on the things in life that were just so incredible for him. Like, the experiences that he had, the life that he lived was like 1 in a billion. And I could never take that away from him. So, I guess the short answer is no, I wouldn't, I wouldn't do it differently. I mean, there's always a question of, could something have been done differently as far as, if I had a eyeglass into the future, say, don't go to Juneau this time around. But as far as the life he chose to lead, I wouldn't go back and try to take that away from him.
What a statement in light of your loss. And you say it with 100% credibility, and I believe you. That's a remarkable thing to be able to say. Thank you for that. That impacts me a lot as a parent, as I consider the choices I'm making on a daily basis to come alongside my boys. And my 12-year-old wants to be in law enforcement of some sort, and I don't know what path that will ultimately take him on, but of course that puts him in harm's way. And we've had to be really aware of that fact and own it and say, yep, if that's his path, then that's his path, because that's what he's called to do. It takes a lot to be a parent, doesn't it? It takes a lot.
It does, yeah. And I think too, it's that there's a lot of things that could change in a 12-year-old's life, right? Or like between 12 and 20. Marc-Andre used to dissect a lot of dead animals in our kitchen because for a time he thought he wanted to be a doctor. So when he was around 12 and you walk in the kitchen, you're like, oh, what does that smell? And it's like, okay, he found something dead and he's dissecting it.
That's awesome. That's awesome that he chose the kitchen to do it.
You have to make dinner after putting that away. Yeah. Yeah. The dead shrew gets put away and then we go on with making spaghetti.
Preparing the night's meal. Yeah. Right.
But yeah, it is hard. And the reality is, as soon as you bring a child into the world, you're going through the process of letting them go. And that's the hardest thing a person will ever do.
I have some closing words that I've written that I want to read to you because I wanted to be able to say them in a certain way and not stumble over them. So I hope you'll give me permission to just read something to you. That'd be all right?
Sure.
I want you to know that your son has changed my life. I'm more determined to be me than ever before because of his example, to hear and heed the unique call of my heart. And his example has reawakened within me a desire to immerse and challenge myself in lonely, wild places. Marc-Andre wasn't perfect, so we won't deify or idealize or idolize him, but we celebrate and honor him for boldly pursuing his way in the world, a way that now inspires all of us to reevaluate our own lives and search more diligently for our own unique way. He lives on in us. And we celebrate and honor you for pouring into him in a way that allowed the real Marc-Andre to emerge, flourish, and bring his own brand of beauty into the world. There's no Marc-Andre, there's no film called The Alpinist, and no life-changing legacy without all of the courage, wisdom, and love you invested in Marc-Andre over all those years. Thank you, Michelle, for the gift of your time, heart, and mind today in the service of all of our listeners and me. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. It's really beautiful. And I really hope you find those wild places.
And hey, everybody, remember, if you're listening, you are going to die. but you're not dead yet. So heed Marc-Andre's example, heed Michelle's example, and get after it. The wonderfully mysterious thing about sharing someone's story is that the same story can mean a million different things to as many different people. Other people's stories come alongside our story, so to speak, and serve as a mirror of sorts. A mirror that allows us to see ourselves more clearly than we otherwise would have. We often find comfort, confirmation, inspiration, and challenge in the image reflected back to us. Comfort that we're not alone. Confirmation of choices we've made. Inspiration to aspire to new heights. And sometimes a challenge to forsake old, unproductive ways and embrace new, life-giving ones. So, I'm encouraged by the certain knowledge that Michelle's and Marc-Andre's stories are working their magic in the hearts and minds of all who listen to this episode. And if I were to pick one thing that I hope everyone gets from this episode, it's the courage to be you, the one and only you, to hear and heed whatever is calling to you, wholeheartedly, unapologetically, and without self-conscious concern for its relative value or utility in the world. We can't know what the ultimate value of the pursuit of our calling will be. Marc-Andre certainly couldn't have known how many lives his story would change. He didn't set out to change lives. He simply responded to the call in his heart the best he knew how. And it turns out that his best was none other than the best ever. And it turns out that his example is inspiring people like you and me to be who we were uniquely made to be, with guts, gusto, and abandon. 5 key insights stick out to me from this conversation that help us understand how to be our true selves. First, our story and our purpose in the world are inseparable. Marc-Andre's family's lack of financial resources in his early years was a constraint that inspired creativity in their family and activated Marc-Andre's imagination and thirst for adventure. In what ways does your story point to your true calling? Next, to be our true selves, we have to determine what we really want. Michelle's conversation with Marc-Andre after graduation created an environment within which Marc-Andre was able to acknowledge what he really wanted and go for it. What do you really want? If you don't know, what's in the way? Next, when we find things that align with the kind of human we are, the naturally occurring collateral benefits are dedication, discipline, sacrifice, and ultimately, proficiency and mastery. Marc-Andre applied himself to alpinism with a focus and determination far beyond anything he'd been able to muster in any other area of his life. What naturally brings out dedication, discipline, and sacrifice in your life? Whatever it is, it's very likely a key to who you were made to be. Next, be willing to put in the work to get what you want. Marc-Andre spent countless thousands of hours becoming the boldest alpinist of his generation, perhaps the boldest of any generation so far. What calls to you so strongly that you're willing to put in the work required to get it? Finally, try different things in life and be willing to acknowledge what fits you and what doesn't, regardless of the prevailing cultural and social norms. Michelle was a keen and attentive observer of the kind of human her son was, and she encouraged him to shut out prevailing cultural and social norms in order to tune in more closely to what he liked and didn't like. What are you giving time and energy to largely because of prevailing norms? What would you begin to give more time and energy to if those prevailing norms weren't present? Ladies and gents, consider the riches available when we persist in becoming our true selves, and consider the costs of not doing so. Here's to becoming who we were each uniquely made to be. What stuck with you from this episode? Message me on Facebook, Instagram, or LinkedIn at Andrew Petty Coach, or email me at andrew@digdeepwinbig.com. And if you're new to this show, welcome. I invite you to browse the archive of past interviews with fascinating people and short, topical solo episodes, all designed to equip you with the mindset and the means to become the person you are made to be and live the life you are made to live with guts, gusto, and abandon. We flip the script by inviting our ancient foe, death, to become an unlikely ally in our heroic journey to leave it all out on the field of life. Turns out, mortality might just be the best motivator available. blasting us out of our ambivalence and complacency and toward the fullness of our potential. I'm so glad you tuned in today. Don't forget to follow the show, and I'll see you next time on Andrew Petty is Dying.